Across the world and throughout the ages, humans have come up with countless stories to explain how the world was created and how humanity came to be. This episode marks the beginning of an ongoing series where we dive into some of the various creation stories around the world and explain the historical context in which they evolved. There's no better place to start than one of the most well-known creation stories, that of the Abrahamic religions. So let's dive in. The Abrahamic creation story is a narrative shared by the three major monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The story originates from the Hebrew Bible and is also found in the Christian Old Testament and the Islamic Quran. Though there are some differences in detail and interpretation among the three religions, the core narrative remains consistent. The creation story is primarily found in the first two chapters of the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Old Testament. The Quran also contains several passages that describe creation, although it does not follow the same linear narrative as in the Genesis account. The Genesis account of creation of the world unfolds over 6 days. On day 1, God creates light and separates it from darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. On day 2, God creates the firmament, which is a dome-like structure separating the waters above from the waters below, and calls it heaven or sky. On day 3, God gathers the waters below into seas and allows dry land to appear. He also creates vegetation, plants, and trees. Day 4, he creates the celestial bodies, the sun, moon, and stars, to provide light and mark time and establish signs and seasons. On day 5, he creates the aquatic creatures and birds, commanding them to be fruitful and multiply. And finally, on day 6, God creates land animals, including livestock, insects, and wild beasts. He finally creates human beings in his image, both male and female, and gives them dominion over all living creatures. He commands them to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. On the 7th day, God rests and sanctifies the day, making it the Sabbath, a day of rest. Now, in the terms of the creation of humanity, God creates humanity on the 6th day of creation. The story emphasizes that humans are created in God's image, which sets them apart from all other creatures on earth. This idea has been the central tenet of Judeo-Christian theology and has been interpreted in various ways throughout history. Some interpret the phrase "created in God's image" to mean that humans possess certain divine qualities such as reason, free will, and morality. Others interpret it more broadly to mean that humans have a unique capacity for creativity, self-awareness, and spiritual connection. In the story, God gives human dominion over the earth and all its creatures, which has been a source of debate and controversy throughout history. Some interpret this to mean that humans have the right to exploit and use the earth's resources as they see fit, while others argue that it implies a responsibility to care for and steward the earth in a responsible and sustainable way. The story also emphasizes the importance of obedience to God's commandments. Adam and Eve are forbidden from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but they are tempted by the serpent and ultimately give in to temptation. This act of disobedience leads to their expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the introduction of sin and death into the world. This idea has been a foundational concept in Judeo-Christian theology and has been interpreted in various ways throughout history, with some emphasizing the importance of obedience to God's commandments and others emphasizing the importance of forgiveness and redemption. The Quran provides an account of creation that shares similarities with the Genesis narrative. It emphasizes that Allah created the universe in 6 days, but does not provide a detailed day-to-day breakdown. The Quran also discusses the creation of humans, with Adam and Eve as the first man and woman, created by Allah from clay. In general, there are various interpretations of the Genesis story and how it fits into the overall historical timeline of the earth. These different interpretations often overlap and interact with one another, and scholars may use multiple approaches to study the Genesis narrative. Also, the interpretations can vary within each Abrahamic religion, as each faith has its own set of theological and doctrinal beliefs that inform their understanding of the text. But here are just a few of the general ways to interpret and study the Genesis story. The first is the literal interpretation, which takes the text at face value, as a historical account of the creation of the world and humanity, as well as early human history. According to this view, the events in Genesis happened exactly as they are described, including the 6-day creation, Adam and Eve, and the Great Flood. There's also an allegorical interpretation, which sees the Genesis narrative as a series of symbolic stories meant to convey deeper spiritual truths. In this interpretation, the events and characters in Genesis are not meant to be taken literally, but rather serve as metaphors for spiritual concepts or moral lessons. Then there's the more mythological interpretation, which understands the Genesis stories as part of the broader ancient Near Eastern mythological tradition. It suggests that the biblical narratives share many similarities with other creation myths from the region, such as the Babylonian creation myth, and should be read as mythological literature, not as literal history. There's a theological interpretation which focuses on the theological messages and lessons embedded in the Genesis narrative. It considers the stories as a means to convey important religious truths, such as the nature of God, humanity's relationship with God, and the origin of sin and suffering. There's the literary interpretation, which appreciates the Genesis story as a work of literature, examining its narrative structure, themes, and motifs, and explores how the text functions as a story and seeks to understand the author's intentions in crafting the narrative. There's also the source criticism and documentary hypothesis, which states that the Genesis narrative was compiled from multiple distinct sources, notably known as the J, E, P, and D sources, that were later combined by a single redactor. Each source reflects different theological perspectives and historical contexts. Speaking of historical context, the time period in which the Genesis story came out of and evolved within is fascinating. Scholars generally agree that the book of Genesis was written in the first millennium BC, although the exact date and authorship are still subject to debate. Now, personally, I have to have a little bit of context when talking about ancient culture. I often have to know what's going on in other cultures or parts of the world to get a full view of the time period. So here's a little breakdown on the first millennium BC in the ancient Near East before we talk about Genesis specifically. The Neo-Assyrian Empire between 911 and 612 BC was one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. It emerged in the early first millennium BC and expanded under various rulers who implemented administrative reforms and military campaigns. This empire dominated the region and subdued neighboring states, including Israel and Judah. The Neo-Assyrian Empire's decline began with the death of its last strong ruler, Ashurbanipal, in 627 BC. A series of internal conflicts and external pressures from the Babylonians specifically led to its collapse in 612, when Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, was sacked. This was then followed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which rose to power after the fall of Assyria. Most notably led by Nebuchadnezzar II, the empire conquered Jerusalem and exiled many Jews to Babylon, initiating the Babylonian exile. Nebuchadnezzar II is also known for the construction of the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The Persian Empire then followed between 550 and 330 BC and was founded by Cyrus the Great. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen at the time. Cyrus conquered the Median, Lydian, and Neo-Babylonian empires, eventually releasing the Jews from their Babylonian exile and allowed them return to Jerusalem. They were known for their tolerance, efficient administration, and vast road network. So, with all that being said, some scholars believe that the book was written during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century, while others suggest that it was written earlier, perhaps during the reign of King Solomon in the 10th century. Regardless of the specific date, it is clear that the book of Genesis was written during a time of great cultural and political upheaval in the ancient Near East. During this era, the Israelite people were living in the midst of a number of powerful empires, including the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians. These empires often clashed with one another, leading to wars and political instability. In addition to these geopolitical tensions, the ancient Near East was also a hotbed of religious and cultural change. The Israelites were exposed to a wide range of beliefs and practices, including those of the Babylonians, Persians, and Egyptians. These cultural influences likely had an impact on the development of the creation story in the book of Genesis. In conclusion, the book of Genesis provides an essential foundation for the Abrahamic religions, offering a compelling and profound account of the creation of the universe and humanity. As a cornerstone of Judeo-Christian and Islamic theology, the Genesis narrative has shaped the beliefs and values of billions of people throughout history. While interpretations of the text have varied, the core message of a purposeful and intentional creation by a divine being remains constant across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The historical context of the Book of Genesis highlights the dynamic and complex culture of the ancient Near East. The interaction of the Israelites with their powerful neighbors and their exposure to a wide range of beliefs and practices undoubtedly contributed to the development of the Genesis narrative, making it a product of both divine inspiration and human experience. Ultimately, the Book of Genesis serves as a testament to the enduring power of religious stories in the human quest for meaning, purpose, and connection with the divine. As we continue to explore creation stories from around the world, the Genesis narrative will remain a valuable point of reference and comparison, showing how civilizations all across the globe have tried to explain their place in the universe. Well, that wraps up today's video. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. It helps me out a lot. And if you have any creation stories from any specific cultures or traditions, leave a comment and I'll be sure to add it over to the ever-growing list I've been working on. Thank you to my patrons, Bean, Fart, and Jag, for supporting me. It really does mean a lot to have people as excited about this channel as I am. I think the creation stories from around the world are extremely interesting and fascinating in general, so I plan on releasing these every so often in between the longer and more research-intensive long-form videos that we've been working on in the background. So, thank you for everyone that's been supporting me, but at the very least, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.